y'all, it's another video from Ant Panda. I'm Panda. Thanks for stopping by. This is an interesting video. I've finally kind of gotten through some of my old library of games. One of those games that I actually finished up was Resident Evil 8 Village. And after finishing Resident Evil 8 Village, I've actually grown a very huge appreciation for the Resident Evil 7 and 8 established lore and games, and here's why. I'll just start off with a bit of, if you haven't played Resident Evil 7 or 8 because it's different from the Resident Evil franchise, maybe try and reevaluate again, because you gotta understand, and me growing up, I started with Resident Evil, the first one, and playing Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3 in the PlayStation 1 era, and those were ultimately my favorite games, mainly because the fact the gameplay was, scary survival horror, and it was really fun. But the other part of it was just kind of the simplistic lore of the story and how these characters kind of came together, and kind of the lack thereof direction or lack thereof description, where you found out through all these different lore pieces, these journal entries, and different things left behind from those that have gone through the incident. And you kind of piece together that information, and there is a few characters along the way, like Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Sherry Birkin, Barry Burton, and all of those supporting characters together, and they do have a really good character base, very broad sense of characters with different priorities in each, which is really what kind of pulled me into it. Yeah, the zombie apocalypse was great, and the virus and the lore related to that, but ultimately it was kind of the I guess you can say, the hint or the tease of learning and playing these characters for so long, connecting with them, and kind of rooting for them at the end. And they weren't superheroes. I mean, ultimately they had skills from the police department, the STARS Bravo team and Alpha team, and some of them have unique backgrounds with medical and marksmen and even pilots, but ultimately they're not super mutants. They weren't superheroes at all, even though Leon S. Kennedy can kind of seem that way. But if you're used to that and you enjoy the lore of that, what's interesting is when you go all the way from Resident Evil 1 all the way up, yeah, some of them are hit or misses pretty much after Resident Evil 4, but ultimately the story kind of evolves and grows as it continues, and that's where we get to Resident Evil 7. And I'm going to talk about all the spoilerish stuff, but after playing Resident Evil Village, just 7 and 8 with the lore and specifically are surrounding around Ethan and Mia Winters and even their daughter Rose, really captivated me a lot after playing both those titles recently. And well, more like 8. Resident Evil 7 I just play regularly because it's just fun to play, but Resident Evil 8 I just finished recently, and it definitely encapsulates the story a lot more than I would say kind of the rest, which is actually quite amazing, and why I wanted to do this video, because the title of this video is, gamer dads will love the lore of Resident Evil 7 and 8, and specifically around these folks. And I want to get into why in a spoiler portion towards the end, which I'll go ahead and designate. But what I will say is, if you haven't played those two, give it a go, and have the understanding that with Resident Evil 7, it almost feels like Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 8 should have been packaged almost together, but they're two massive games. Like, even though you could go through the story of 7 fairly quickly, and 8 is kind of the same way, I like how it was divided, because it definitely is two different chapters in the same kind of umbrella between the Winters family. And what's great about it is that you're kind of given the hints and the idea about Ethan Winters as just like the same theme in the previous ones, that he's just a normal man looking to survive and looking to get through the hellish nightmare that he's experiencing with Mia and eventually his daughter, if you saw it in the trailers. But I want to get into the spoiler driven portion, but know that, as you're playing Resident Evil 7, definitely plan to play Resident Evil 8 if you've enjoyed it, because there is portions of 7 that plays very much the long game in Resident Evil 8, and some of those ideas and thoughts and things you experience that isn't explicitly named out there and super clear until you kind of complete the whole package together. And that's why I have to say that Capcom did a really good job playing the long game in this regard, and why I think definitely gamer dads and soon to be dads in the future will probably enjoy this a lot more. I mean, don't get me wrong, anybody will enjoy the lore, because they just did such a great way of storytelling, the events of Resident Evil 7 and how that feeds into Resident Evil 8 Village and how it all connects. And where Resident Evil 8, you're still getting surprises and new thoughts, new ideas, new information from 7 that wasn't exactly clarified and completed or highly indicated as, kind of described of what happens, which is what makes it great. And even the DLC was really fun and enjoyable. So here's my plea to you, though. If you're gonna play, Resident Evil 7 and 8 both share very similar fantastic features, which is absolutely great gameplay, good first person shootery, good weapons, amazing graphics and details. And honestly, I enjoyed them both on the PlayStation 4 and also my PC in both regards. You can speedrun it, you can play it just for the lore, and they also have some fantastic DLC elements to it. So if you're a fan of that and you love the survival horror aspect, which it does emphasize and encourage in both those titles, then definitely give it a playthrough. So, but I will say, just keep this in mind, that if you're kind of looking to make that next step into a family, if you're just kind of an evolved and kind of a more grown-up gamer who loves a good story, entertaining story in relation to family motivation of surviving, this is an excellent set of 2 titles. I recommend that you play both, because if you play 7's great. 7's actually probably, out of the 2, it's still my favorite because of how innovative and wonderful of a switch it was, even the build up for it. Resident Evil 8 just kind of captures that same existing stuff and adds more. You even have a merchant that's in there. You have the mercenaries, and you also have a bunch of other features that came back that Capcom has included. And again, all this stuff, I know this is old, I know this has been talked about for a while, but I just wanted to take a moment just to go through these spoilerish portions and talk about how fantastic this was. So at this point, I'm going to start talking details of the spoilers that come with Resident Evil 7 into Resident Evil 8. So if you have not played it, go ahead and stop at this point, play through those, and then come back here and we'll talk more about it. So I'll give you guys a few more seconds. But anybody else that has completed 7 and as well as completed Resident Evil Village, stick around and we'll talk the details of what makes this story just so great. No one's hiding by the door? No one's by the window? Alright, great. Alright, let's talk about 7. So Ethan Winters is indicated as a regular man that is trying to survive and trying to also rescue his wife Mia Winters, which I will say throughout this particular title, as you're going through it and fighting against Evelyn, who is the grandmaster behind the mold and all the terrible things that turns the Baker family into the crazy hellspawn that they are, especially Jack. Ethan's just a regular guy, and that's all you're kind of given as far as the hints go. But if you play Resident Evil 8, it is eventually revealed to you that technically Ethan Winters has died in Resident Evil 7, and He died when he was smacked around and hit by Jack after the guest house portion when you finally fend off Mia Winters from the chainsaw event. But what is amazing is that because during that fight and that time, obviously Ethan, it's kind of gives the impression that he survived, but his hand is literally cut off into it. And always the topic of discussion when it comes to Resident Evil 7 is how do you put your hand back on there, staple it on, and it just starts working with his little health meter that he has as a watch. And they never really answer that very well because obviously that's not the realm of physics. The other thing, or just real life in general, but the other thing too, which was really incredible, was that during a portion of the game, if you fight against Jack and let's say Jack ends up, toying around with you, messing with you, and almost kills you, there is a segment, and you'll see it here, where he will literally cut your leg off and he will put a chem fluid in front of you for you to crawl to that chem fluid and then actually put your leg back on just to kind of show that, which means that even Jack knew that you were dead and the only reason you're alive is because of the enhanced selenite mold that has overtaken Ethan, is now giving him the power and everything that he has, which is why the chem fluid works well in his leg when he tries to put it back on, as well as his hand. Even though in the beginning in the guest house you put the chem fluid on and it does help you out a little bit, but I don't think it has much of the healing factor intensity until he is dead. And that in itself was just amazing because that always bothered me after I played Resident Evil 7. And, just pouring on this liquid and all of a sudden you're just better. And it's crazy to me because the fact that now, because it's kind of explained that he is living because of the fact that he's got this mold that's overtaken his body, giving him his extra, I wouldn't say healing powers, but I guess versatility, even though it's kind of what happens in Resident Evil 8 when Miranda pulls his heart out and he's still living because of the fact that he's part mold, or all mold at this point, but now he becomes even more mold and more fragile. It makes a lot of sense. Another thing too is if you end up playing Chris in any of the DLC and also in Resident Evil 8 Village, he doesn't use chem fluid. No one else does. The only person that uses chem fluid is Ethan. And with Chris Redfield, he uses a shot that's supposed to help him with his health and help him with his wounds, which actually makes a lot of sense, which means definitely some thought has gone into this whole mess that comes with Resident Evil 7 and 8. So it's fantastic. Resident Evil 7, obviously Ethan goes through, he takes out the Baker family, and him and Mia technically live. If you pick the alternative ending, obviously it doesn't really do much with the Baker's family's daughter, Zoe. I mean, it doesn't do much, even though I will tell you this, like when I played through 7, I thought Mia Winters was kind of crazy, and it just didn't really, I guess, sit too well. Like, I didn't really have a big connection. In fact, most of the time, she always kind of picked that umbrella kind of initiative or priority in protecting Evelyn, which always made me think that she wasn't necessarily the best influence. But, so yeah, you go through 7, and then you start Resident Evil Village, and then, of course, in Village, it talks about the Book of Shadows kind of fairy tale, and with Ethan, you actually are there with Mia and your daughter Rose, and I just gotta say, like, Capcom did a really good job, even in the intro, because you felt, even though there was something weird about Mia, and you can kind of tell, you still felt like you wanted to protect your family, you wanted to be there to, protect Mia and Rose for sure, because Rose is just a little baby, and they did a really good job showing Rose as a little baby in the details, and you just want to protect that family and do really well. So then, yeah, Chris Redfield comes in and kills Mia, takes Rose away, and you kind of have this little hatred towards Chris Redfield, because even though, like, even in the past games, he's always kind of a hothead, a little bit of a jock, a little bit focused on, just kind of that Boy Scout mentality, you always end up finding that he really does feel for those, especially in the DLC of 7, because he's there for Zoe, he's there for Ethan, and he does the best that he can, even rescuing them towards the end. So it's quite a switch. I actually thought there was going to be a little bit more of like Chris is infected with something and forced to do it, but the story ends up just being a little bit simpler than that, which happens. And sometimes you don't want to give all these storytellers credit, because when you think about fan fiction, how deep you can go a lot of times to make the simplicity of the gameplay and making the game itself, it's more of a simpler explanation. But Ethan Winters wakes up, he's outside of the truck, and then of course you go into the village and you fight these werewolves. And I have to say, the horror of fighting werewolves versus zombies or even mold is incredibly scary. And the thing that surprised me the most was not just those, though, is also the dolls. So all the top lords, it's almost like a Castlevania type Lord of the Werewolves, Lord of the Vampires, except in this case it's vampires, it's the little Fishgill guy and a bunch of other ones together, and of course Lady D that everybody knows about with her daughters. And of course you go through as Ethan killing these folks, and you feel the same way. Like he gets some of his fingers cut off, and of course it doesn't grow back, and he doesn't reattach them or anything, so you feel a little bit more fragile in this sense. And you still kind of, as you're going through this, you want to go save your daughter and Rose, and at the same time you're also thinking, I'm just a man, that's it. And it was pretty incredible going through all of that. But I have to say, like, the gameplay, the mechanics for meeting with the merchant, which they still don't really reveal much. I'm sure I'm going to do some more research on that. And getting better weapons, getting better by eating fancy food to improve yourself, instead of like the steroid shots that you got in 7 and the pills and stuff you took. So it was a really great gameplay. But I have to say, the biggest hit, even though they hint about it along the way, is towards the end act, when you're facing it against Miranda. Once you take out massive guy with the hammer, and I could try to pronounce their names, but I'm always gonna get it wrong, because it's not, it's very either European, Romanian, or whichever, even French in some cases. So we'll just say that the Lord with the big hammer that can control kind of electricity, which those electricity minions were the other thing that scared the crap out of me, because one, you couldn't kill them. They kept following you. They're like the regenerators that you played in previous titles. And you're just in the darkness, and they're just finding you and trying to stab you with chainsaws. And oh my god, I about lost it when I was playing through that. But after you face off against all those different lords, and then you face them towards the end, then you face off against Miranda, and you finally meet up with Chris, which, by the way, being on that little mini tank with the little turret and the machine gun was badass. I loved that gameplay. That was such a great boss fight, because it's so out of the norm. You're used to, ammo management, using the right weapons, waiting for the right rotation, and then doing the damage when you need to. This was just pure, straight chaos of just annihilating this guy. And it was fantastic, and I was so happy about that. But ultimately, at the end, then of course Miranda shows up, and you find out that Mia actually was Miranda from Chris that was at your home, which is why she was acting so weird. And of course, with Miranda, you're thinking she ain't much, and then she pops around everywhere, does her special powers, and then just pulls your heart out. And then you think, well, crap, that's the end of Ethan. I thought going in that Ethan was going to die. I just kind of had that thought and idea. So honestly, I wasn't too shook or anything like that. But what did it for me was after, Chris you switch perspectives and you play Chris and you go through and start fighting, and then you find Mia, which you're just like, Well, I'm shocked. I was never given the hint or idea that she was still alive. And honestly, she did a lot of, rebuilding and rapport. I actually liked her a lot at the end of Village after more than 7, because 7 I just thought she was a crazy loon. But then she reveals that Ethan actually is special. And then that's when it shows that dream afterlife sequence, which I love those. They did it in 7 when he's talking to Jack Baker. He got a chance to talk to Jack before he went crazy, and his entire family before they went nuts from Evelyn. And it was just a nice, safety, symbolic, and just immersive, enjoyable experience, because you know that these people aren't super crazy. They're just victims, and it sucks. But they're there to help in spirit, at least. But in this case, they reveal that obviously Jack Baker actually killed Ethan Winters just from a sucker punch, which, I mean, them being that strong, it makes sense. And I think that's, honestly, I think that's a good way of kind of emphasizing that. And then it's showing the afterlife dream sequence of Ethan talking to Evelyn, which, Evelyn, you just kind of are like, I already killed you, you're nothing to me. And then she kind of reveals, in her own way, that the answers, you just don't want to admit it. And it just was done very, very well to kind of show and reveal the spoiler that, hey, you've been dead this whole time. There's a piece of the mold, or the entire mold that's in me now is in you. And this is it. Like, you can survive, you can keep going, but you're a mold. You're not really a human anymore. I mean, I could go crazy. I'm sure there's fan fiction and people going nuts about saying, well, if you're a mold, how can you have a child? And honestly, I think it's kind of nice because it feeds into that, because the fact that somehow this mold was able to keep him alive, doing normal human functions, and then having an offspring that is more powerful than him. And I think that's probably the most excellent message that you could come out of this, because Rose, everybody fears and wants to capture her for her power. And I think that was a great message, saying that we want our offspring better than ourselves. And obviously that finishes up, and the whole time while Chris is trying to get in that crater, Ethan's in there fighting Miranda, while Chris is putting the explosives together on the selamite mold and trying to get that finished up. And then that's when Ethan does exactly what the Book of Shadows does, which is the ultimate sacrifice for him and Chris. They finally become buddy cops at the end, which is fine, even though I know Ethan kind of hates but loves his guts at the same time, and vice versa, where he bestows upon him that he needs to protect his family. And I think that was fantastic. And him paying the ultimate sacrifice, at least, that's what Capcom says. That's what the message is, because it says, at the end of Village, this father's tale, his story is done. And then, of course, after the explosion with Mia, Chris, and Rose actually surviving through Ethan's efforts, just makes everything so great. And honestly, the motivation, the importance of being able to save your family and children, and being able to push yourself to the limit, those are the moments I love. Lore driven games like that. Metal Gear Solid 4 with Old Snake going through the little microwave portion was another moment that I enjoyed. That, thank you, Hideo Kojima, for that. It's moments like that I enjoy, these interactive storytelling games, and it's kind of what I enjoy the most. And yes, I kind of regret I didn't get a chance to play through Village when it first came out, because, man, props to Capcom on wonderful storytelling there. Resident Evil's always been in my blood when it comes to me growing up and enjoying survival horror. And I mean, it's tough to do everything nowadays as an adult, especially when you're expanding your own family with your own children. And that was just incredible, especially with the ending sequence where, it shows Rose kind of growing up, young daughter that she is, going to Ethan's grave, paying respects, and also showing little rough tendencies of being angry and hate towards the world, but also being happy, being grateful, and knowing that her father's sacrifice means something is also something that's incredible, and I really love the ending to that. So anyway, this is just a story kind of going through that, telling about my thoughts and actually an appreciation. So if you're somebody that even decided to just go through and listen to the spoilers without playing Resident Evil 7 and 8, go ahead and play it. It's fun. The gameplay is just so good. The survival horror elements are wonderful, and it will just immerse yourself. Just don't get eaten by the massive scary baby thing chasing you in the sequence in Village, because that was scary as all hell. But growing up and evolving, just like the Resident Evil franchise, going from an event that kind of formulate these characters and expands them, an event that kind of formulates and expands these characters outward and evolves, so it's more focused on character driven stories, with some events that are kind of sprinkled in, like with werewolves and ghosts and vampires and things. It really just kind of shows how wonderful the franchise is going, and it's something I greatly appreciate and am super happy about. The one thing I will say, though, is I know Jill and Chris had kind of an adventure after Resident Evil 3 and Resident Evil 5. And the Biohazard Revelations original one with just with Chris and Jill. Jill Valentine deserves a separate adventure. Like, I know Resident Evil 4 is being remade, I'm sure. And I know Code Veronica is coming out, which I'm looking forward to, with Claire Redfield's adventure. But I'll tell you what, I think we're due for a Jill Valentine adventure just all by herself, in something brand new and amazing that brings it back to survival horror. Anyway, this is my video about gamer dads loving Resident Evil 7 and 8. I encourage it very much. Feel free to hit me up in the comments to talk about it, because honestly, I haven't been able to stop talking about this since I completed it. So feel free to say you love it, hate it. I know there's some dedicated folks out there that don't like the direction, and I know there's some that do. And honestly, I'm a unique individual that actually likes both. I think they're all great for the times that they are, and I definitely encourage you to watch and play all of it. So anyway, feel free to comment, hit me up. Feel free to like this if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe if you're not part, and we'll talk about more content and more tech and things of that nature. So thanks so much. Have a great night.